Hello fellow coders, welcome back to another episode on CodeMaster Quest. Today we are going to count the number of islands on a map. So let's dive right in and find the question description on LeetCode. Here is the problem statement. Given a 2D binary grid which represents a map of 1 and zeros, we should return the number of islands. In this grid we are going to have m rows and n columns, and 1 indicate land cells and 0 indicate water cells, right? And here's the definition of island. An island is surrounded by water and is formed by connecting adjacent lands horizontally and vertically. And you may assume all four edges of the grid are all surrounded by water, right? So if you look at the examples here, at the end we should return 1 for that because we have just one island here, right? If you look at here, we can connect all these ones in the grid and form an island. But here for the example number 2, we have an island just right here, an island with this this cell, and another island here, right? So at the end we should return 3. So let's get back to the Visual Studio Code and try to implement this problem. First thing first, to solve this question we need to have the function signature. So let's come back to the browser, make a copy of the function signature and paste it in Visual Studio Code. Now to solve the question, and since we want to change the input grid, let's make a mutable copy of the grid. So let's say grid equals to grid. Now I want to define a variable to store the number of islands. Count is equal to 0 by default. And let's make 2 variables to store the number of columns and rows in this grid. So let's say rows is going to be grid.count, and columns is going to be grid0.count. And we can have access to the the first index of our grid because based on the constraint of the question, the number of rows and columns in this grid is going to be greater than or equal to 1, right? So now let's come back to the Visual Studio Code and try to define our DFS function. Let's say define DFS, and since we want to perform a DFS algorithm, we need to have the coordination of the starting cell for this DFS, right? So let's say I integer, j integer. And we are not going to return anything from this function. Okay, now to perform our DFS algorithm, I need to check whether we reach to the to the boundaries of this grid. So let's say if I is less than 0, or j is less than 0, or I is greater than or equal to rows, or j is greater than or equal to columns, or we are on a water cell, right? Grid I and j is equal to 0. In this case, we can return from this DFS function, right? Otherwise, I want to change the value of this cell in the grid. So let's say grid I, j is going to be 0. Then I want to perform the DFS algorithm for the adjacent cells. So let's say DFS I minus 1 and j, and same thing for I plus 1 and j. Now same thing for j, I, j minus 1, I, j plus 1. Okay, here's our DFS function. Now we want to perform the DFS function for all islands in this map. So let's say for I in 0 to rows, for j in 0 to columns. If we are on an island cell, we need to perform the DFS, right? So let's say if grid I and j is equal to 1, then we should increase the number of islands. So let's say count plus equal to 1, and then DFS for I and j. And then it's good enough to return the number of islands, which is stored in the count, right? Now to make sure our implementation is working correctly, let's bring the example from the LeetCode. Make a copy of this input. We expect to have 1 as the output for this function. Let's come back to the Visual Studio Code and store our input here. So let me say let's map, which is going to be characters. It's going to be this one, and let's call our function print num islands, and then pass the map to it. We expect to have 1 as the output of this function, right? So let's run our function. It's going to be 1, right? And we can change the rows and columns to constant, right? So let's say let instead of var. Let's run my Swift file one more time. It's 1. So we expect that this solution working correctly. And as the last job, let's submit this implementation to LeetCode. There we go. Here's the solution.